Welcome to NBM English. I am Nate, and this time we will discuss H.P. Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space, a scary story about an alien meteorite that falls onto farmland. It is a rather simple story, but with a complex mixture of ideas and themes. The story is about a meteor that lands on a farm, and the usual scientific studies are conducted. There's a mystery of what it is made of, and eventually plants, animals, and finally humans are consumed by a dreadful color coming from the meteor. This disease spreads across the land until finally whatever has landed on Earth goes back into space, leaving only a little bit of the substance left. There is a question of if whatever's lingering is still consuming land slowly. Now, the story is told through the viewpoint of two simultaneous narrators. It starts with a reservoir surveyor who is curious about what is called the strange days, when something terrible seemed to have happened in the area. Part of the land he is tasked with looking at is the main focus of these tales. Because of both his professional responsibilities and curiosity, he goes out and witnesses for himself the unused farmland called the Blasted Heath. It is a section of land that seems to have recently been in a fire, but after many years, nothing has grown in the blackened land. After many failed attempts to get more information from the locals, he finally finds an old man named Ammi Pierce, who is a close neighbor to the property. As a reluctant witness, he tells the story of how the place got its name. The rest of the story is told from his point of view, although some of it, such as the experiments of the scientists, could not have been a personal experience. There are also times near the end of the story when the surveyor starts to interpret how Ammi must have felt watching the farmer's family slowly disintegrate and die. At this point, there is some mix-up in who is telling the story. By the very end of the story, it again becomes the surveyor giving his opinion on what he was told happened. At the beginning of the story, he has become so frightened that he went back to Boston and gave up his position, not wanting to spend more time there. He was glad that it would be covered by water. Because of the horrific events at the Blasted Heath, no one in the area of Arkham wants to talk about it, because it continues to have negative consequences. Before the meteor crashed from space, the worst events talked about were the witch trials, and an island that possibly had an altar where evil rituals were performed. Considering the mythology that Lovecraft built up in his writing, it is probable that this brought the cosmic destruction, but none of his usual ancient ones or demigods were named. Ammi, the old man who told most of the story, as was said, lived next to the tragic property. The impression is that he knew the family well and possibly was friends with the father. The surrounding area, the family, and the farm are described as having been very inviting and prosperous. All of that changed when the meteor and its destructive contamination decimated the farm and family. Rumor persists that after all these years, at least 1 inch of land is still getting taken over by the dark blight. Many of the townsfolk and farmers probably don't want to think about that possibility. They would rather talk about it in whispers in the hopes that some few observations are only rumors and not in fact true. The surveyor wonders why Ammi hasn't moved away and conjectures that he was probably infected with the meteor plague because of how much he was involved. None of the scientists were still alive. Many of the residents, particularly those of feebler minds, were said to have gone mad while the more intelligent ones moved away. There might even be other globulars from the meteor that are on the property of the gardeners, where all of this took place, sucking away at the land, waiting to become strengthened. All of these potentials would make the townsfolk want to forget the past in the hopes the events are over. Curious as the scientists were by the meteor, and the Gardner family father was just as excited by this event at first as they were, testing it probably made things worse. They poked and took off some material from the surface for study, and it did have some incredible properties, mostly because they couldn't properly study the samples. None of the instruments could detect all but some rudimentary substances. In their need to understand what had come out of space, they gouged a large chunk out of its core and popped some kind of globular bubble. There was nothing found inside of it, but a strange color hard to describe. Soon after this, both the samples and the meteor began to shrink and eventually turn to dust before disappearing completely. None of the scientists knew what to make of it all and never seemed to question if there was any danger, even when they knew of its heat properties. They probably didn't care much for what kinds of hazards might exist for the Gardner family or those who lived nearby. None of them, after the meteor and its parts were gone, returned from any follow-up investigations. They were only mentioned again in passing that all 3 investigators had died. Those in the city of Arkham don't much care for or trust the farmers, often making fun of their lives. When the wildlife and plants begin to get sick and die, the Gardner father takes some samples to a newspaper for them to write a story. Why he doesn't go back to the scientists is probably because they have lost interest. He probably hoped a newspaper report would gather enough influence to have professionals who might be able to do something to get involved. This destructive decay has started to devastate his crops and livestock. Instead of investigating and writing a serious story, the newspaper mocks what they consider an unintelligent group of superstitious country residents. That tension between those who live in Arkham City and the outlying farm districts is seen in the plans to build the drinking water reservoir. The Surveyor tells about very upset farmers whose lands are where the water will flood the valley. There is even some minor conflict among the farmers themselves, where those outside the flooding zones are more casual about this reservoir getting built. The blasted heath may be a physical danger, but it is a reminder of how social cohesion is starting to break down. It was already evident between the city and country, but the country itself has contracted a disease tearing families apart and inviting corrosive elements that even foreigners cannot accept. They try and live there for a short time, but become frustrated and leave. A correlation does seem to exist between how the meteor disease affects nature and what it finally does to humans, particularly the Gardner family. The first to be noticed is the wild animals, those species that have not been domesticated. A rabbit is seen jumping across the road in a huge enough leap to scare both horse and rider. Later, a woodchuck is shot by some local boys who take one look at it and are repulsed by how ugly and twisted the animal seems. Very soon, at the time of the first harvest, the plants are larger and form the outside in better shape than they have ever been. However, inside, they are dark and putrid, a complete waste. There's nothing to salvage. It seems to be a comment on the farmers living in the area. The only examples are the Gardners, who are described as good citizens who go to church and school, with a very prosperous farm. The description of them is of a relatively large family that is well respected and proud. With the meteor decay, they start to become lazy and accepting of the bad water and food. As the story goes on, like the fruit, they eventually become useless and no good. By the end of the story, the mother and son go insane, while other family members disappear into the well and become skeletons along with deer and horses. The father loses all hope and is drained of life, becoming some kind of sludge. This is much more than a horror fantasy about what can be easily described as radiation disease. It's what happens when a farm loses its ability to be productive. First the land goes bad, then the livestock are lost, and finally the family becomes lethargic and inattentive. Mothers, siblings, and the father as head of the house break apart and finally dissolve. Like the mysterious color, hard to describe, such a condition burns, cold and wet, but it burns. Skunk cabbage is a plant mentioned in the story that becomes both a representation and contrast to the color out of space. It has a peculiar shape to it when first sprouting, and is yellow or green when fully formed. Another property of the plant is its distinct rotten smell when walked on or damaged. This smell is repellent to animals and humans, but attracts insects that are considered beneficial to other plants, helping in pollination. It also generates enough of its own heat that during spring the snow is melted. Under the influence of the meteor color disease, the skunk cabbage properties are exaggerated. There is no mention of it attracting the bugs, but large badly formed insects are said to have come to the farm at one point in the story. The plant's already strange hues of color start to take on the dreadful colors now dominating the landscape from the meteor. Like other plants, they become unusually large and deformed. Of course, with the radiation-like blight, there's no snow that can long remain without melting, as it continues even up to the time of the Surveyor looking over the area. This once beneficial, although still repugnant plant has lost any useful function. The plant now mimics the color out of space and its unearthly properties, working off its own negative natural properties. There are some hints that the color out of space is a living organism. There are a few aspects that are used to describe living things. This includes organization, reproduction, eating, and growth. At least a few of these are done by the color, although enough are left out to put into question how alive it might be. Fire does many of the same things that a disease-producing organism might do, such as replication, but it doesn't truly have an organized structure. The color has some form of organization, with its ability to remain inside the well as a central nervous system. It is described as living down there more than once. Animals and humans are drawn to it like flies in a Venus flytrap, to be consumed and become part of its structure. Once again, the well is an opening like a mouth, although eating away at living things is not constricted to just that area. It eats away at the animals and vegetation outside the well's location. The story is very particular about it growing day after day, and years later, after most of it has disappeared back into space, it still grows by inches into other areas. An argument can be made that it cannot be a life form, as it doesn't replicate. Although it grows like fire and spreads like disease, two things used to describe the decay, yet it is more like fire than virus. It is a singularity that does not reproduce outside of its own existence. There are no others like it forming, nor does it seem to be consisting of a community of independent parts. As for a conscious intelligence, devastating and plotting as it might be, there's no indication an intelligent force is at work. There is some implied suggestion when it finally escapes Earth in a column of light, but that is pure speculation. It isn't even certain if the blasted heath is really growing or if there is anything actually left behind. Men meddling with the unknown force of an alien substance started the terror, and another meddling, for the most part, seemed to have ended it. There's no clear explanation of why the color out of space decided to return to the cosmos above the Earth, but it did leave. A man went to the well and started to poke and prod with what was at the bottom of the well. Suddenly the house and farm became agitated with the color and with light, before a beam of the strange color shot up into the sky. There were some peculiar dancing sparks along with the rest of the light show, but eventually all that remained was the blackness of the scorched earth and a constant, unearthly glow. It cannot be known if the examination of the meteor let loose its horrors, or if it would have done it all on its own. Much of what this story does leaves it to the reader's imagination. Part of this is because of the imperfections of the author's ability to write in a clear way, while others because that is what makes the story interesting and even thought-provoking. A few movies have been made about or inspired by the color out of space, but they don't capture the true fear in the story. Many decide to focus on the horror of a family gone mad and becoming violent psychopaths. But that really isn't what happens. No one is taken over by an alien to do some strange bidding and kill others. What happens is a slow disintegration of social and ecological health. Perhaps the movie The Blob is a much closer movie to the narrative of the story than the others have intended. It is about a substance that consumes and then takes over the land while others, helplessly or without caring, look on at the tragedy. It is a tragedy that will soon come to them if they continue to ignore or forget what has come before. The color out of space has not ended. It has simply become part of the landscape. It has become part of a community that is being fractured and disappearing until eventually they are washed away. Click the subscribe button and notification bell to not miss the next installments and analysis.